Well, for the second time this week, NASA's Artemis rocket did not fly.
I'm sorry, but that's just how engineering works.
We have to believe that something good is going to happen in this world.
We are here today with Justin Barber, who directed Space Coast, that will be showing at the Coconut Grove Film Festival this year. Justin, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
Very well. Thanks for having me.
Of course, thank you for being here. I thought your film was so beautifully complex between following the true story of the numerous attempts to launch Artemis 1 and then tying in that history of the Space Shuttle Columbia disaster through that central character, Mark. So I have to ask, how did this film come about?
Yeah, well, I set out just to make a movie about the Artemis launch. Actually, I just set out to get a nice shot of the Artemis launch for my Instagram feed. I had just heard about, they were rolling out the rocket, and I heard it was going to be this big launch, and I had nothing to do that particular month, and I had all this equipment out from another project, and I was like, oh man, that's going to be a great, just for the sake of photography, I want to go film that rocket launch. So I went up to Cape Canaveral, and I camped out on this bridge to be in the right position to get this great shot, and they scrubbed it. And then they scrubbed it, they ended up scrubbing it 2 more times, and I kind of was in for a penny, in for a pound at that point, because I wanted to get that shot. And I was like, oh, I'll just camp out on this bridge, 2 more times. But in that process, I realized there's actually a story there. That's actually the story of them trying to launch it and failing. And so that's when it sort of transitioned from being, this is just going to be a one-off, just cool photograph, to being, wow, there's actually a narrative here. But, lots of people set out to make documentaries about these rocket launches. And I kind of wanted to do something different. Particularly when NASA produces them, they just tend to be sort of like cheerleading movies for the project. And I just wanted to do something that was a little more authentic and kind of emotional and dramatic. But, as an outsider just filming the rocket launch, I didn't have that emotional kernel yet. And then I'm out there on this bridge, and I'm getting ready to film this launch, and this crazy yellow vehicle blasts by me on this bridge. And it's like, looks like this little yellow spaceship. And I just knew that, wow, that's interesting. I've got to get a shot of that. And then when my camera assistant flagged the guy down so he'd pull up and chat with us, I got to talking to him, and that's Mark. That's the main character in the documentary. And so it was just sort of happenstance that I met him. But just in waiting for this rocket to launch and chatting with him, I realized, wow, this guy actually has an interesting story. And so I began to weave it in. Because basically I knew when I set out to make this movie that it was going to have a great ending. That everybody's really hoping for this rocket to launch, but they're doubting that they might actually pull it off. And then when it launches, it's going to be a great, spectacular ending. But what really makes it great emotionally is if you have a main character who sort of like never thinks it's going to work. He's like this grumpy kind of older guy who's very pessimistic. So that when the rocket actually launches at the end, that's the great story. That's the emotional ride I was looking for. So it was really serendipitous. Sorry, that was a long answer to your short question.
No,
that's how it came about.
That's awesome. That's so interesting that you found Mark while filming. It wasn't that you planned the story around him. Which is incredible because looking at it now, he's the central character. He is the story of what's going on in all of that historical context.
And if I could say just one more thing about Columbia, you're right. When I first started making the project, it was just going to be called like Artemis Rocket or something. And then when it shifted to being more about Mark, I realized, no, this is Space Coast. This is about the people here and what they go through, and this sort of man, as the avatar for that. And with Columbia, one other thing I wanted to mention was that it was also the 20th anniversary of the disaster when we shot the movie. And so kind of weaving it into it, just it felt right. It felt like we were sort of kind of telling the history of NASA up to this point and where they are and what we're going to do in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And what was it like working on a project that just seemed to continue to grow? Because, again, you went to the launch, you weren't planning really anything. Then you found Mark and you're adding him to the story, and now you're adding the aspect of the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster. What was it like with planning what you were going to film and then just trying to get that footage along the way?
Yeah, it was very difficult not having a script to work off of, right? Like building a skyscraper without a blueprint. It's very, very tricky and dangerous. But knowing that it's going to be about a rocket launch, that it's going to be about this big event that had a natural destination, that was very helpful. I basically knew what the beginning, middle, and end of at least part of the story was. Okay. So that was like the Christmas tree that I could then start, decorating with these ornaments. So that kind of being my guiding star was helpful. Like whenever I was lost, I always knew at least I'm working towards this spectacular ending. And all I have to do is just make it as emotionally impactful as possible through these characters. And so The hard part, honestly, was shooting the launch because it was a bit like a National Geographic shoot in that shooting a rocket launch and then shooting it at night, there's just a lot that technically goes into that. I didn't have access. I was doing this unauthorized. I didn't have cooperation from NASA. And so the best point in the area to film that rocket launch was at the peak of this bridge. It's Florida. It's flat. The only point of elevation you're going to get is a bridge like that. And this bridge is 10 miles away from the launch pad just off of the premises. And I had to get there and camp out for 24 hours in advance each time, just to make sure I was holding that one spot, because this bridge fills up with people and photographers. So just like, and then it's 10 miles away, so it's a telephoto project. I've got this, effectively a 600 millimeter lens, and it's kind of just me for the most part. So I'm like hiking my stuff up this bridge. I'm camping out there. It's raining, and then doing that 3 times. So like it was physically arduous. So it was hard in that sense, but of course that is always the fun part looking back. But then the real hard part, so we kind of went about making the movie. We shot the launch, and then I had a little bit with Mark, but then I knew he was my main character, so then we did a follow-up shoot with Mark, where we got all of his material that then padded out the movie. And then once I had a rough edit, I was able then to go and pick up certain scenes or shoot some reenactments of certain things he told me that I know I wanted to be more cinematic or more impactful. And it took about like a year and a half to plan and shoot the rocket launch, to edit the movie, to shoot additional material. And as you said, it took that long because it was a bit of a discovery process. The edit was grueling in that I really just iterated it until it was really tight and really working for viewers. So that's kind of how it came together, I guess.
Absolutely. And you mentioned shooting some of those reenactments. How did you work to plan the story and then later on in the editing room with using some of that supplemental footage? Because I know you have some of that historical footage from the archives and some footage from NASA of on the launch pad, and then working that in with what you did with Mark and all those reenactments. What did that look like for you?
That was another grueling part of the process, was just sort of finding all this archival material. I had the Artemis rocket launch, and I had been kind of clipping news footage of the Artemis launch throughout the process. And then I had once I had Mark's story in the can, Mark also gave me some of his materials, photos and stills that he had from his career. And then, I kind of had the story in my mind at that point. I knew what the arc was. I knew it was sort of him as the main character. It's about this guy who achieves this American dream working on the space shuttle, but then it becomes a nightmare. And it's about, how do we go on in that situation. And, I had those base materials for my shoot. And then it was just about pouring through the NASA website and pouring through YouTube and pouring through other whatever sites I could find to just like find the key moments from NASA's footage that supported what he said. And the NASA footage, it's taxpayer funded, so that's ours to use. You can just take whatever you want from their website. There were other sources though, where stuff that was harder to find. I had to use some Getty and had to pay for some footage from other places, which is painful. But man, the real grueling part was just like hours and hours on end, just trying to find. I watched a lot of the Columbia mission footage, and I had found audio from the astronauts and mission control that I had never heard before in documentaries, just like little snippets of like common conversation you have with your coworkers. I have of the audience on the space of the crew up there, and there was like little moments like that were like the diamonds in the rough I was looking for. These little unexpected moments between the crew that really humanized it and made it feel like, wow, you really relate to these people because it's just like people at work, But it was long nights, like certainly just trying to find that stuff. And this is one more funny story I guess I'll say about that.
Yeah.
So when I went to shoot the rocket launch, it's me and just a ton of other like space nerds on this bridge, like rocket fans. And I met this one character, his name is Dimitri. He was a high school student from Alabama or somewhere. And I just like got friendly with him, and he's this massive like nerd. I shouldn't say nerd. He's a great young man who is really into the NASA archival community, and he's like really up to speed on. Oh, there's this guy in Seattle, and he has the only 4K scan of the shuttle blueprints, and like there's this whole community of people who like to find this archival stuff. Anyway, so it was through that connection, just meeting this random kid on the bridge, that he ended up becoming my archival consultant, and he has a credit in the end of the movie, and he helped me just kind of find stuff, and he showed an older person like me how to use Discord so I could like talk to people and help me find stuff. So that's another serendipitous part of it, I guess.
That is so incredible, and it's just the chance that you happen to come across Mark and then you happen to come across this great community of people who also just want to tell that same story and learn more about it. Was it a similar process trying to get the footage from the different attendees at the rocket launch? I know that you use kind of a mix of just different people who were going back over different days and using that footage in it. Was it also a lot of combing through and seeing what you wanted to use, or was it more, oh, this is what I was able to get, how can I use this?
It's a bit of both. So there's also a community of just photographers and people. There's a whole community of people who love capturing the launches in video or still photos. And I met many of them up there in Titusville around the time of the launch. And I got friendly with some of them. And there was another guy next to me who had a telescope, and he had an iPhone on the back of his telescope, and he was just using that to film the launch. And I just made friends, and some of them liked the project, and they let me use their footage in the movie. So sometimes there are shots that just other people around me filmed. And it was just a matter of kind of being friendly and ingratiating myself in the moment. And then a key piece of footage was, so another person I randomly met at the first launch attempt was this woman, Ellie. She's the blonde lady in the movie. And she's there, she says, to see the Artemis launch she's there to see her first rocket launch. And I interviewed her at one of the first attempts, and the rocket didn't go. They weren't able to launch it. But for the final attempt, she came back, and she filmed the launch herself and her reactions to the launch. And she graciously let me use her footage. And that was just great, because what I was really desperate for, I had all these cameras set up to film the launch. Like, it's this thing that's going to happen over the course of 60 seconds, and you get one shot to get it. So I wanted as many cameras as possible. And how many times, you never see a movie and a big explosion happens and there's only one angle. They cut to make it dramatic and play with time. So I know I needed multiple angles, but the other challenge was that, man, I need as many reaction shots of human faces as possible. Because that's the other thing that's lacking from a lot of these kind of technical documentaries, the humanity. When you watch a Spielberg movie, it's not just the spaceship, it's the great reaction shot. It's like, oh, we're going to need a bigger boat. It's like his eyes after he sees the shark. So I was desperate just to have as many people reacting to the rocket as possible. And I didn't get many good ones. I was focused on shooting the rocket, and I was just desperate for those more reactions. And Ellie, having filmed herself, was just dynamite, because she's honestly reacting to this spectacular event, and she really sells it. Another funny story about her was, so her story is that she actually was a TV news reporter, and then she pivoted in her career, and now she is a kind of a space influencer. She does journalism on space topics and industry for YouTube, and that's what she does now professionally. So I think that was a cool story too. Ellie in Space is where you can find her.
That is so incredible. Again, all these just little things happen to line up for each other for this film to happen. And I want to go back to a previous work that you did. You did Phoenix Forgotten a few years ago. And for those not familiar, it's a science fiction film, but it's more of a documentary style. And now Space Coast is a true story, unlike Phoenix Forgotten, which is more fictional. Did you find any similarities in working on the two projects because of their style?
Yes, actually. It's kind of a sister movie to that one in weird ways. Some people have theories about like writers and filmmakers and like artists, is that for psychological reasons they're always kind of being pushed back to the same story and telling it over and over again. And as the edit for Space Coast was shaping up, I was like, man, there's actually a lot of similarities to my previous movie, because the previous movie, Phoenix, it was a documentary, but it also was taking place in modern day and sort of flashing back to this mystery from the past, from 20 years ago, that was also in the late 90s, so similar era. And it was also sort of about characters affected by this tragedy, in the case of Phoenix Forgotten, about these missing kids, and how that tragedy derailed their lives, and about how they couldn't really get over it. And then I'm making Space Coast, and it's like, wow, my main character has this chip on his shoulder about NASA, but it's because of this tragedy that affected him 20 years ago. And it was, so in that sense, yeah, there were similarities that emerged just like in the story. And in terms of just the technique, every time you make a movie, you learn a lot. And I made Phoenix Forgotten a couple years ago, and took everything I learned on that movie and applied it to this one. And so what I can say about that is editing. I learned so much about editing and storytelling from editing Phoenix Forgotten, and I applied that to Space Coast. And that's really why I think the movie works really well for audiences, is that I'm really proud of the edit. It like really moves. It's not boring. I never set out to make documentaries. I wanted to make feature films, but I somehow always end up making these documentary style projects. But I think when I try to make a documentary, I just try to make it as exciting for people as possible, because I think it's a visual medium. It's about movement and light and action. So anyway, that's what I set out to do with Space Coast. I think I achieved it. And that's how it was informed
I
by the
think you
previous
did.
movie.
Yeah, I think you absolutely did. I mean, I was on my seat the entire time, on the edge of my seat, just trying to see what was happening because I knew Artemis 1 was a launch that had some issues. And without spoiling the end for anyone who doesn't know the context of it, I was truly trying to see, is this rocket going to take off? Is it actually going to succeed? So you did a very nice job with that. And a quick follow-up, I know that you were more based in film and you just somehow end up doing these documentaries. What has been the biggest shift in this real storytelling rather than fiction for you?
Man, well, I will say that over the last 5 years, like truth has been stranger than fiction. I guess that's what it was. I was working in advertising. My bread and butter was directing commercials, and I had done some films. I was living in Los Angeles up to 2020. And then when the events of 2020 happened, and just to go back, when I was in high school, before I ever got into film, I was the editor of my school newspaper. I was like a student journalist. Like that's kind of the box I fit in when I was a student. And then 2020 happens, and I did have this impulse of like, man, there will never, anybody who ever wanted to be a documentarian or a photojournalist, like, and if they're shutting off the valves for all of our other work now anyway, I kind of activated myself, and I did start actively looking for documentary projects in 2020 onward. Well, partly because the commercial industry was completely shut down, so I needed something else to do. But also, I kind of got that bug, something bit me that was like, you can get that historic photo, And with Space Coast, I did set out to make a movie that was very much of our era, that captured what was going on in the country just after COVID, because it's about NASA and it's about the Space Coast, but it's more broadly about our country. People should see the movie, I guess. I don't want to get too deep into that stuff, but that's kind of what drove me, I guess, to make another documentary after finishing Phoenix Forgotten and saying, "Wow, I'm never going to make a documentary style movie again." This kind of project and this topic, as I described, it did kind of come about serendipitously. And then, once I captured that launch at the end, spoiler, I kind of knew I had a special ending to drive to, and that's kind of what pulled me through the project. Because documentary editing is brutal. I mean, what can I say? Like,
It is.
yeah, if you know, you know.
Do you have any future projects you're looking forward to? Are they more documentary style or maybe more on the film route?
I have to say, they ask you the same question everybody asked me the same question when I finished Phoenix Forgotten, but like, we're still finishing it. We're still promoting and selling the movie, and it's like it's never happened for me that I had another one teed up as soon as I finished my last one. So there's always things we're working on as filmmakers, but it's like I just got this one out to audiences, so I need a little more time. Sorry. I will say this, like, I wanted to also make Space Coast as a way of just getting into telling stories in that space and in that world. I for so long I worked in advertising and I did commercials and video for like big tech companies and consumer products, and we were always like, man, we got to get into aerospace. We're so inspired by this industry and what's going to come in the future. It's like an amazing time. We've got to get some of these clients for our commercial work. It never really materialized. And it's always been just like a fascination of mine. So with Space Ghost, I decided like I'm going to make this movie, and then maybe I can get hired to do like a Starship story or something. So there's a little bit of that in the back of my mind too.
Absolutely. Well, that's all so incredible. I hope everybody enjoys watching Space Coast at the film festival. Thank you so much for your time today, and we are so honored to be playing your film at the festival this year.
I can tell you one more quick story.
Yeah, absolutely.
That people really get a kick out of. So, and this is something you learn in just making movies and going through life, I guess. But like, all right, so I was making this movie Space Coast about the Artemis launch, and I had no cooperation from NASA. I did call them. It's not like they were mean to me or anything. It's just hard to get inside, So I was trying to get official permission to like work with them and be on premises and film the Artemis launch, but I kept getting rebuffed. And when I first started doing the outreach, I was actually working for a news organization, and they told me no. But I kept trying. I kept emailing, and they kept telling me no politely. And then finally, there was an event at Kennedy Space Center that I really wanted to photograph, and I called, and they said no. And it was the 20th anniversary of the Columbia accident. It was going to be a memorial at Kennedy Space Center. And I'm like, I just got to go shoot this. So even though they told me no, I just drove up there on the day with all my gear in the car. I parked my car. I went into the gift shop. I bought a jacket that says NASA on the back. I put on the NASA jacket. I went to my car. I got the camera, and I walked in, and nobody bothered me. And I filmed this whole amazing event And that's where I actually met the rabbi who's in the movie, because he spoke there.
Oh.
And I was able to approach him afterwards. So that's another serendipitous thing. I just randomly struck up a conversation with him, and then he agreed to work with me on the project. But the last thing I'll say, I'm there filming. I got the NASA jacket on. I got my camera. Nobody's hassling me. And I'm filming this, trying to get the shot, and I almost bump into this lady in a suit standing next to me. And I go, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to get in your way. And she's like, no, you're fine, keep shooting. And I look over and down, and she's got a name tag on. It's the lady who kept telling me no.
Oh, that is hilarious.
So, there you go.
And she still didn't give you any problems then on the day of?
She was fine, day of. She was very nice. I mean, she's doing her job, you know. They must have get tons of requests for, like, stuff like that. But it just goes to show, you have to be polite, but you can't take no for an answer when you're making a movie.
Absolutely. And I think with everything you've said and all these stories about making Space Coast, this film was meant to be. Everything lined up so that way it could be made. And I'm so excited for everyone to be watching it at the film festival. But thank you so much again for all your time. And it was such a pleasure speaking with you.
And you as well. Thank you so much.